So I put together a video about using a facade pattern and tried to explain a couple different ways you can set up a facade. But as I was walking through it, I was like, you know what? I don't really think this is giving a good real world example of why you might want to use something. So, use something like this. So I figured like I'm going to put together something a little bit more concrete. Still not a good example because it's a little bit stupid, but I think it at least will show you some of the ways that I've leveraged facades in terms of plugins. And what I mean by that is being able to build an application that doesn't really know much about um, the other pieces that you want to inject into it. And these pieces, you can just keep adding more of them to extend your application to give it more functionality. So I've had a lot of success being able to build sort of extensible products that you can let developers work in isolation in their own little plugin, deliver that. Doesn't really impact the other plugins in the system, which is great. So when it comes to testing and things like that, you can keep things pretty isolated. And yeah, I've had a lot of success with it, and I figured I wanted to I show an example where, again, not a great one, but can illustrate how you can use a facade for that. So um, what I put together is a sort of an entry point project called Facade. This is based on the one that I had put together in a video the other day, and I've hacked it apart. But what I've done is I've created two plugins that I will read in to this entry point and an API that the plugins can use. So I figured might as well start with the API. It's really simple, but the idea is that I will have something that plugins can implement called an iGenerator. So I can have any number of plugins that can create any number of iGenerator implementations, and these generators will just generate objects. Again, this makes it a dumb example, but the idea is that, and they generate iFancy objects. So if I go into the signature of that, it's just an empty interface. You could put special things on it, whatever you want, but for this conversation, it's any number of plugins can provide any number of implementations to iGenerators that just spit out objects, right? Really, really simple. It's just so that we can get objects from plugins. And I want to show you that we can build a small little application that pulls in these objects and has no idea what the implementations are because it doesn't care. And then it's going to feed that back out to plugins to do other stuff with. So that's what the generator does. So that's almost like a publisher of data. It generates data. And then I have this printer. And that's also part of our plugin API. So plugins can expose printers that we can take advantage of. And a printer exposes a method that says whether or not it can print a particular object, and then it has a mechanism to print it. And print for this conversation just means writing it to the debug console. So again, nothing super interesting, but the idea here is that if you think about how we were using the facade pattern from the other video, uh, we have a whole bunch of different objects that meet the interface of iFancy objects, a whole bunch of them coming from different sources, and then we have these printers that can, some of them can handle them, some of them can't, but instead of writing code everywhere, and I'm just gonna put something right here. It's not going to compile or anything. Instead of putting code everywhere that says, oops, I missed my parenthesis. If whatever. So say this took in an iFancy object. So instead of saying if object, meets some condition, print this way. Else if object meets some other condition, print this other way. Instead of writing code like this everywhere, the facade hides that from us, and we can just say, hey printer, and it's a facade, go print these objects for me. I don't know or care how you do it. You're responsible for figuring that out. So the facade will basically take in these printers for us and hide the fact that they do something special for each implementation. So that's the idea. So that's what this plugin API looks like. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's really simple. Again, just an interface that plugins can implement that makes a class that generates some objects, right, and another class that can print certain objects, whatever it wants to. So I'm going to go ahead and show you plugin one. I put all the code just into one file. I am using AutoFac for this, so without going into too much detail on AutoFac, I'll kind of explain what it's doing, but I'm going to walk you through the bottom part first here. So this plugin has a generator, right? This is one of the plugin API pieces we looked at, and it's called Nick Generator. It implements the one method that iGenerator has, and it's going to yield and return 3 instances of objects. And if we quickly look what they do down here, literally nothing except implement this interface. So again, super, super simple. It's really contrived because these objects don't really do anything or carry any data. But the other interesting part is that we have a Nick printer in here. Nick printer, when it is asked if it can print things, it says, I will only print it if the object is of type Nick will print these. It's the only thing it will print. You'll notice that I have this other one that says nobody will print these, and this thing doesn't handle it at all, right? So this printer will literally only print implementations of Nick will print these, but our generator actually just spits back a whole bunch of different things, right? It gives back 2 instances of nobody will print these and 1 instance of Nick will print these. So when we go to print these all out, no one will ever print these, and we will print, this printer here will print only instances of these objects. So what we should see when we print one of these is the word Nick and then just the type that it's printing out. So pretty simple, right? One generator in this plugin that will generate 3 objects for us, and one printer that will only print implementations of Nick will print these. Very simple. Plugin 2 is almost the exact same, almost. I'll come back to the AutoFac stuff at the end after I explain this one and just explain what AutoFac does for both of them. This one's close. It's almost the exact same. It has a mic generator and a mic printer, and the other one was yield returning 3 objects. This is only going to yield return 2, so it has 1 less, whatever. You'll notice that the printer is a little bit different. This printer, when it's asked if it can print an object, says, I will print it if it's either Mike will print these or Mike will also print these. Okay, so it's able to print either of these types of objects. So we're returning 2 of them here, and we would expect that this printer is able to actually handle both of these. Make sense? So this plugin has a generator that can return 2 things and a printer that can print either of these. And when it prints it out, it will say Mike and then the type. The other one says Nick, then the type. So from what we've seen written out here, based on what things can be printed and what things can be generated, there's 4 types of objects that can be generated. Here's 2 of them. All right, I'm going to jump to the other plugin file. Here's the other 2 that can be generated. But in terms of what can be printed and who can print them, only this printer will print this object. No one will print this one. And I'm jumping back to the second plugin. And this printer here will print both of these. So there's 4 things that can be generated and 3 that can be printed. Pretty simple. Hopefully live, what I'll do at the end of this is add in another plugin that can mess with some things so we can see how that all kind of works. But let me explain what the AutoFac stuff does here. I don't want to get in depth into what AutoFac actually does. because that's a whole other can of worms. But what we're able to do is actually expose out that we have um, a generator and a printer from this plugin by using this syntax here. And our entry point, when it's loading in DLLs dynamically, will actually be able to resolve these types. And I'll explain that part. But this is how we basically tell our dependency injection framework that we have some implementations that someone can consume. But that's a whole other topic. That's just how I wanted to leverage it for this. So we have an API project and we have 2 plugins. Great. Let's see how we use them. So what I've done was I made sure that when plugin 1 and plugin 2 they get put into the output directory of this Facade project. So the first thing we're going to do is build our dependencies. Again, this is a bit of an autofact thing. I just want to cover it very briefly. So I made a method here that says build dependencies. This first little part just says go into our current directory and load in all the plugin star DLLs. So it's going to load DLLs for plugin 1 and plugin 2. I didn't mean for that to jump, sorry. So we should get 2 plugin DLLs that come back from this. And I'm just using some link here with assembly load file. So this will be 2 assembly instances, one for plugin 1 and one for plugin 2. The next little part here is just something autofact specific that says go load the modules, right? And if I jump back to each of these plugins, these things at the top here were the modules. So there's one of them, and here's the other one. This part just tells autofact go load the modules from the other plugin files, and when we make our container, we're able to resolve the things that those plugins put onto the container. That's all that's happening, but I just wanted to cover what that does, because if you're not familiar with autofact, it's something to go look into, but just to explain how we're getting that information out. So we make our container. That's the first line. So by the time we've run this line, we should have a container that we can pull some stuff out of from our plugins. So when we go to create our facade, and I'll show you the facade in just a second, but what we're going to do is go ask for all of our plugin printers. Right? We have 2 plugins, each one has a printer. And what we're going to do is make our facade and then register both those printers into our facade. So the other video kind of explains the whole mechanism behind facades, but I'm going to go jump down to our facade implementation down here, and we'll see what it does. I'm just going to collapse these so we can focus on the one method at a time. It has a register method, right, which we're calling here for each one of the plugin printers. And what that register method is going to do is just add that printer to a list. It's really, really simple. Like I covered in the other video, there's a ton of different ways you can try to make facades and how you want to do checks on things, how you want to register, all that kind of stuff. This is just one of those ways to do it. I'm just keeping it super simple here. I just wanted to provide a real sort of example of injecting plugins to leverage this. So that's how we register. And to make a nice API, our printer facade just lets us print a fancy object, right? If you'll notice in here, I'm going to scroll to the top here just to prove a point. This file, which is all of the code for our entry point, doesn't have any of the using statements for plugin 1 and plugin 2. It has no idea anything about plugin 1 and plugin 2. Nothing. It doesn't know right now that there could be 30 plugins, there could be 0 plugins. It doesn't know, and it doesn't care. That's one of the beauties of how this works. So we have this nice signature that we can just say, go print this fancy object. So people that call this facade, they don't care who or what is printing it. They just know that someone is responsible for printing it. So how this works is, again, something really simple for our facade. We give it a fancy object, right? And then all we do is we go look through our printers and find the one that can print it, right? Really simple. You'll notice I used where, not single, not first, not single or first or default. So technically, the way this facade works is that if there were multiple printers that could handle it, you'll get multiple things printing it. Okay, so really simple print interface on it. But what we did when we created the facade was essentially took the printer plugins, we registered them to this facade, and now we're returning it out. So that's all that this method does here. Now we come back to the top. So what we've done is we've made our printer facade. It's all set up and ready to go. So all that this program does is it asks all of the generators. So again, we're using AutoFact to go get all of the generators from the plugins. There should be 2 of them, one for Nick and one for Mike. And then we're going to ask each generator, go generate all your objects for me. So we're going to store that in this enumerable called all the things. And then what we do is we iterate through that and print out each one, or we try to, right? We try to because we already said that one of these should not get printed out. And if we jump back, it should be this one should never get printed out. Okay, so I'm going to try running this and we can talk about what happens. I made it go to the debug console, so we should see it down in this output window. Just the way I'm streaming stuff right now, capturing different windows and stuff, for whatever reason my video card doesn't want to support it. That's irrelevant, but that's why it's happening this way. So I'm going to go ahead and run this program, and we should see 3 things get printed out. Because there's 2 objects that come back that no one can print, and there's 3 instances of objects that come back that people can print. So let's run it. Let's see what happens. And then from here, I'm going to try modifying those printers. We can change some things around and just see how the behavior changes. So this is running. It's finished. If I check in here at the bottom, we have our 3 lines. One for Nick will print these. One for Mike will print these. And one for Mike will also print these. You'll notice there's no point where we said anyone was printing out nobody will print these. Okay. Now, one question you might ask is, how do I know the right printer printed these? Great question. Let's go prove that to ourselves. So let's go back to these plugins where we have the printers. I'm just going to change this a little bit to use string interpolation to be maybe hopefully a little more readable. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the type of our printer instead of the name. Right? Then we should be able to, maybe we could do like type full name. Okay, let's do that. I'm going to make the other printer do the exact same thing. So when we run it, we can see the full type that's responsible for doing this. And maybe we'll put the full name of the type that we're printing out too. Okay, so I'll do that for both of them. And this should prove when we look at the output that essentially what we're getting is from the right plugin that's handling these things. Okay, so it's running. So plugin 1, Nick Printer, was able to handle the Nick will print these objects, and plugin 2, Mike Printer, was able to handle both of these types here. Okay, let's try something interesting then. So we had 2 generators, we have 2 printers, and each printer has some conditions. So what you might want to do is say, you know what? I feel like we were generating some objects and I didn't have any insight into what was happening. I feel like there's some extra objects, namely these ones, that are sneaking through. No one's printing them out. I wonder what we can do about that. And what you could do is you could make a whole new plugin. I'm not going to do that just to keep this super easy and you don't have to watch me create projects. I'm going to copy this whole printer. I'm going to call it Sneaky Printer. And what Sneaky Printer is going to do is print out everything. Okay, it's going to print out everything that's not null. Let's do that. And how it's going to print that is it's going to say shh, and then it's going to print out the fancy object that comes in. Why, I don't know, but let's do that. This is a super sneaky printer. The way that we make this accessible to the rest of our application, I can't just make this, but I'll show you how easy it is. All I did was I copied and pasted a printer, made sure that it will handle everything that's not null, right? And we're just going to add that up here. This is why AutoFac is super nice. So sneaky printer. So sneaky printer, like I said, will be able to print anything that's not null, which is really cool. Okay, so what do we think is going to happen? Are we still going to see all of the Nick and Mike print lines? Are they going to go away? Are some of them going to be there, some aren't? Are we going to be able to see things that we couldn't before? Spoiler alert, yes, if I didn't mess anything up, which is also entirely possible. And you'll notice I made a change. This is the best part. I made a change only in this plugin module. That's the only thing I touched. That's it. I didn't touch the second plugin. I didn't touch the core application, and I'm about to change the behavior of our entire program. Okay, so let me clear this out. I'm going to go ahead and run this. I get excited about this kind of stuff because I think that once you see how this can be leveraged, you'll find opportunities where you can say, I don't have to go rebuild all of my application just to prove out or extend some functionality. And that can be super powerful when you're working in teams of people, when you're trying to have extensible products. I don't know. I'm a huge fan of being able to do this. So let's check the output. Ready? Okay, so we got some extra print lines. These are kind of ridiculous, but this says shh, and then nobody will print these. So we never got to see these before, right? This thing says nobody will print these, but we put in a sneaky printer that can actually check for them. And then we have our other original one that says Nick will print these. The other thing we'll notice is that we got another shh line because how many nobody will print these objects are there? Right? There's two. Let's see what happened here. We got how many? Oh, yeah, there's the second nobody will print these. I kind of lost where I was looking. So this all comes from plugin 1, and we had 2 nobody will print these objects, right? That's the first one here, and this one here, because there were 2 instances of them. And you'll notice there were 2 printers that were actually able to print out Nick will print these. There's only one of those generated. Only one. But 2 printers were able to print it. The sneaky one and the Nick printer. Cool. Now, what else is interesting about this? Where did I put the sneaky printer? I put the sneaky printer in plugin 1's code. Right? I'm going to quickly jump over to plugin module over here. You can see in the top left it says plugin 1. I put sneaky printer. This code knows nothing about anything from plugin 2, right? If I scroll to the top here, you can see there's no using statements for plugin 2. It knows nothing about plugin 2. What's cool about that is that our printer was able to interact with things from plugin 2 that it doesn't even know about. Now, this could be dangerous. It depends on your application, depends on how you want to isolate things and things like that. But this could also be leveraged so that you can have different parts of your system interacting and extending each other without having to do anything super complicated. So don't get me wrong. There's reasons and ways that you might want to be able to protect against this kind of thing. But we were actually able to, like I said, change our core application where without change the functionality of our core application without touching it. So again, sneaky printer was able to print out one of the instances here, then the normal mic printer was, and then the sneaky printer was able to print out the other implementation, and the mic printer was as well. So we basically, by copying and pasting a printer and changing it a little bit, adding it to a plugin, we were able to hijack what was going on, do some different cool things, and didn't change anything with our core code. Um, what does this have to do with facades? The fact that if we didn't have the facade, if we didn't have this facade, we would have to write code that said, like, if the type was this, handle it this way. If the type was this other thing, handle it this other way. This facade essentially let us take in behavior from plugins, put it behind a nice little interface for us. None of our calling spots ever have to think about the fact that there are plugins. You can argue that might be a dangerous thing, like that can involve some complexities where so you don't realize that your system is potentially fanning out to other systems. So yeah, you can absolutely hide complexity that way, but that's the trade-off you're making here, is you're hiding the complexity that might arise. So again, this facade sort of acted as a single entry point to our printing classes, and there's three of them now. And if you were to look at this code when you're calling print, you would be none the wiser that there are three things that can actually handle these objects that come in. So that's a pretty simple example that explains how you can use plugins to to basically provide extra information into a system, so a little application in this case, and how you can provide implementations from plugins that can take that information back out. And facades can really help facilitate that because your core application doesn't have to know about the implementations in each of your plugins, right? Doesn't have to know about that at all. And I think that's super valuable, and hopefully that helped explain how some of that works. Thanks.